People in and around League of Legends discuss pro players and their strengths and their positions within the relative hierarchy of other players and their teams and their regions in much the same manner as these people would discuss players in other esports titles, in other sporting disciplines. The problem is that League of Legends, in contrast to a game, for example, like Counter-Strike, or a game like football, or a game like baseball, is a game that presents some rather unique problems in assessing the strength and skill level of individual players. I mean, first and foremost, it is a team game in an esports sense. So there's a great quote from Mata, OGN, Worlds, LPL champion, probably the best support player of all time, former Samsung White player. And his quote says, "Your ability to work with your teammates is your level of play." Now, this is a really great quote, because if you look at Mata's career, when he was in Season 3 and he had fantastic teammates, he won OGN. He was a god tier player. When he was in Season 4, he was in one of the best teams in the whole world, made top 4 of all the OGNs that year. They managed to actually win Worlds in incredibly dominant fashion. Season 5, he goes to China. He goes to a team with some quite lackluster carries. He's on a team that wasn't that good, Vici Gaming. It was just him and Dandy, basically. And suddenly his level's really bad and he's not very good. Now, sure, he's in another region. He's playing with players who speak Chinese, blah, 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 all the rest of it. But suddenly his level's drastically different. And people said, oh, he just doesn't care about it. It's just the money, etc. But then Season 6 comes along, he gets RNG, much better team, he gets better teammates, eventually he gets a really great teammate in the bot lane, comparable, in fact, even in playing style, to Imp, his old bot lane carry, who made one of the best bot lanes of all time for Samsung White, in Uzi I. And suddenly, his level's really good and his team's really good. You know, you can see why he's come to this conclusion. So one of the problems with League of Legends, more so even than games like Counter-Strike and other team sports, is that how good your team is massively increases how good you will look within the game in most cases. I mean, this is why we get this famous trend throughout the history of League of Legends that whoever the best team in the world is, when I don't just mean best as in like a placeholder team like GE Tigers in spring before the playoffs began. Whenever someone's the best, as in they've won like Worlds or they've won a huge tournament or they've won OGN, whenever someone's considered that best team in the world, go back and look, and nearly always people suddenly start to talk about how almost all of their players, so let's say 4 or even sometimes all 5 of the positions, have players in it who are top 5 in their region or top 5 in the world when we get to the level of like the world champions and the OGN champions. This happens almost every time, which if it was true, really makes League of Legends seem like an incredibly whack game. That like apparently strategy and team play and shot calling and like one player being godlike, so all don't really add up to that much because you just get the best players overall and you're always the best team and you're the ones that win the most. Seems a bit naive, isn't it? Also, the idea that someone could compose such a team and put it together and somehow predict in advance that guy would become really good. All quite unreasonable ideas. I mean, likewise, we have the same thing happen in LCS. And one of the worst problems as to why this happens, and one of the reasons why I want to make this video, is I even see pros and analysts doing this. I mean, just look at the all LCS voting for NA the last couple of splits. It's been an absolute abomination of just the top teams getting nearly all their players voted in on Team 1, Team 2, or Team 3. I mean, this happened in EU LCS in Season 4 summer split. I think this was the one where Alliance and Fnatic, the top 2 teams, got like every single player in the first team all LCS was from one of those 2 teams. So the notion was there wasn't a single player at any role in any team other than those 2 who could be the best at their role for that split. I mean, ridiculous notion. As a result, the best 2 supports that split, Nif and Yellow Star, apparently. This is really the world we lived in back then. Another problem that the League of Legends has is that the game tends to snowball towards the winning team because the winning team gets more levels. The winning team gets gold from the kills and assists, which they then spend on items, which add to their stats, which make them more powerful, which make them more likely to win games and have control over the map, etc., etc. So because the game snowballs towards people, people's stats look better in a way that they don't in the more static games like Counter-Strike, where as long as you have the same weaponry, when it resets every few rounds, you can get those kills even if you're in a worse team, even if you're on the losing team. In sports, obviously, in basketball, doesn't matter if the other team scored 50 points. It doesn't make your two-pointer that you take 3 minutes later harder or easier. It's still the same two-pointer. You still defended the same way in general at that point in the game. It doesn't affect it the same way. League of Legends doesn't work like that. It snowballs and gives a massive advantage to the winning team. And as a result, having better teammates who snowball the game with you and for you helps you look better. Now, another problem with the game of League of Legends and how it affects players is that there are side factors which do not show up in the stats box, which actually massively affect how well your stats end up being and how well your performance might be judged. So, for example, how many ganks do you get in a game? How many ganks do you not need and as a result still thrive in the game? What is the pressure like in the other lanes that might draw people away from you so you don't get ganks, but you also don't get ganked, and as a result, it looks like you're just amazing 1v1? What is the balance of star players elsewhere? Have you got stars in other lanes, which means all the focus is drawn from you and the picks get taken away from the stars and you get to have your picks? What's going on in that particular sense? I mean, think about this. What do you think happened to Hauntzer, this player that everyone hailed as like by far the best NA top laner in the summer split? What happened to him when he went to Worlds and suddenly Doublelift and Bjergsen didn't just dumpster their lanes completely, didn't just shit on the opponents in every big team fight? What happened to Hauntzer then? Oh, magically, he got worse as well. His level dropped off as well. It's almost like his level was tied to the team because he had 2 carries in other lanes and they had picks taken from the mid lane, etc. And all these other factors, and ganks went to other lanes, etc. It's almost like all these factors were at play in helping him look so fantastically good. I mean, same thing with Looper. Looper went in Season 4 from people like Fion claiming he was a genius top laner and this godlike player with all these player champions he could play, to Season 5 in China just being non-existent, not even being a top player in LPL. Now, sure, yes, different region, language differences, etc., etc. Other players in other good teams had good performances. And sure, Mata fell off, Dandy fell off, Looper fell off. Players who went to bomb teams suddenly fell off. It's almost like some of their level was based on the level of the team, how much they were winning, as a result, how good they looked. Then you got to consider, what are the coaching impacts? You can have amazing players. If you have a bad coach who coaches you the wrong style and the wrong picks and forces you to play a poor meta and makes you take picks that don't make sense for you, you're going to look worse. The outside world might not know that. They might think you chose that champion. They might think this is how you think you should play the game. They will then make judgments based on all these factors. Then let's add in shot calling. You could have a great players. You could have a good balance of team. If you have bad shot calling and the other team has good shot calling, as we saw when there was lineups that had players as good or better than Cloud9 in NA in Season 4 and Season 3, they lost because Cloud9 had the best shot calling. So one of the problems as well is team strength winning you games can also make the champion pool of some of the lesser players in those teams look way better than they necessarily are. So another quote from Mata, all-time great support player. Just because a player has played many champions, it doesn't mean that his champion pool is very deep. And yet this is what we see. Oh, this player can play 4 or 5 things. Oh, he's pretty good on this champion. Is he though? Or is the rest of the team so fantastic? Or is that just something that he played just so that it would help the comp? And as a result, his team won, but he wasn't necessarily that good on it overall. Another aspect, and this is one of the biggest ones, that just wrecks League of Legends when trying to assess players and talking about them as though it was like, a player in basketball having a good season this season is improved, or he's gone off the boil, he's getting worse now, is the meta changes radically. I mean, this is best seen at the jungle position. When they do those radical jungle switches, okay, so one of the problems with League of Legends is ever since the defensive masteries got buffed, we've been in this world where it's like you have to have a tank in most cases in the comp. And the tank nearly always is going to be the top laner, depending on the meta, or the jungle. So whenever we have shit like Cinderhulk get buffed, like we did in spring of 2015, well, it got created, but you know what I mean, the buff happened. Then we end up with situations where suddenly the jungle position almost does a 180 on what you should do in it and what the strengths of the meta are. And so as a result, we get these players who were just tank players who are suddenly really effective and really important, like Bengi. Or we go the other way and we go to carry junglers, and now tops are playing more of the tanks. And now all of a sudden, all these other players who play the Nidalee and play the aggressive champions in the jungle, they're bodying everyone. Now you have to do that, and now the tank jungler can't survive. These players aren't suddenly just getting better or worse overnight. The meta is literally determining who can be the best and who can look good, yet we talk about it in an absolute sense of, oh, he's just a bad player now, he's really fallen off. Sometimes people even talk about, oh, in season 4 he fell off a lot, and don't even sometimes mention the context of what happened within the meta, like a radical shift. Another position that got really fucked over was top lane, because in season 4, I mean, this basically became a supportive position. This became a position that couldn't be the hard carry the whole game. Or it could. You just couldn't hard carry to enough that if someone else had the best, if you had the best top laner and they had the best mid laner, they would have natural advantages playing around the mid lane in a way that you wouldn't. And so we saw all these tanks. We saw all the defensive Dr. Mundo bullshit being played top lane. I mean, think of one of the lone exceptions in season 4 of a true top lane hard carry was Save, right, from Najin Whiteshield. Now, he's a player where he literally had his whole team play around him. His team literally nearly always got him 2 specific picks, and they would even give him the red buff from the jungler so that he could be better in lane and have a chance to do better in lane and have carry the game. Now, even players like Flame, still one of the best players in the world in terms of carry tops, he didn't get the red buff. He didn't have the whole team play around him. They still played around mid. They played as a team. The coaching staff was different there. So as a result, players can look better or worse, again, based on the meta itself. I mean, some examples of how it's so difficult to rank these players and judge them as though we could judge them individually when they're parts of teams and metas and regions and different strengths elsewhere in their teams that are affecting their outcome. I mean, think about this. Nearly all Korean exports, as a general rule, look worse when they go elsewhere. Now, that's not just factors like obviously do play a part, like language differences, culture differences, people who their teammates not practicing as much. They're not in as good teams anymore. That's a key aspect to talk about. Now, there are lone exceptions which go the other way and also show how difficult it is to rank players, because players like Piglet and Impact, who people said like they're done, like, you know, they don't really fit their teams anymore. Suddenly Ryu, they have massive revivals, even after, for example, in the case of Ryu, he's supposed to be washed up after that poor period in Millennium, after he came along and he was in Rockat for that one tournament, that IEM Cologne, and then eventually he gets to HK, now starts to build it together again. So it goes both ways. They get way worse, they get way better. It's almost as though, again, there are factors outside of just the individual aspect that radically affect how good you look in the game. Even within Korea, you have people change teams who just overnight look way worse. So in season 5, Chaser legitimately might have been the best jungler in the world. That's no exaggeration. He was playing for Jin Air, if you remember. Now, he shifts over to Longju, who actually had better teammates than he had in Jin Air, and have, in theory, the makings of an all-star team. He even has a better mid laner in Coco. The team ends up way worse. The team ends up dysfunctional, quite poorly coached, and he just looks way worse. And suddenly, he's not even talked about anymore as a top jungler. Suddenly, he's not even considered as like, oh, SK Telecom's got to get Chaser. No, it's just like, oh, Chaser was good that one time, but now he's not anymore. Go the other way. Player like Trace can just hang around in OGN, hang around in LCK, it was always called OGN back then, for years, and then suddenly get 10 times better and be incredible and have this insanely deep champion pool where he can play everything and the meta picks, and he's doing all this crazy stuff, and the whole game's based around him, he's carrying the get. That can happen as well. Do you really think that these players are all just sat around and then all of a sudden they just go Super Saiyan mode, and then the next day they're just like, oh, I'm drained of my power, like the next 6 months later, and then suddenly they can't do anything? We ignore all these other contexts. Now, it's not that people shouldn't attempt to rank or compare pros. I mean, I particularly do want people who are experts to do this and to give us real reasons to who they think is the best and their rationale behind it. And also, it's good that fans do it because it allows them to have something to discuss around the virtual water cooler, Twitter as it were, and to be able to talk about things and to talk about who their favourite players are and who you think did well. It's not that. It's that there are just way more factors to consider in a game like League of Legends than many other esports and many other sporting disciplines. And so I actually just find it sad that a lot of experts, people who know far more than I do about the game, seem to get drawn into these very simplistic ways of thinking and ranking and hierarchies of players, where it's not just that they pick the criteria they're going to emphasize, they'll draw it down to one or two things and say, well, I mean, obviously this player has to be the best because, you know, his team did win the league and stuff. Like, very simplistic logic that doesn't make a lot of sense and doesn't make use of their expertise, actually, and ignores a lot of the context outlined here. So League of Legends has some serious problems with how we assess pro players on an individual level.